When I was a child, my family fell into hard times, and I was entrusted to my uncle's family. This was from my late elementary school years until I graduated from middle school. But from high school onwards, I lived with my parents. Our financial difficulties were due to my father's business failure, but my father managed to rebound, and we lived affluently from high school onwards. He was generous with his financial support to the children of his struggling siblings, an act that would have been impossible without my aunt's consent, making her a truly wonderful person. The period I lived at my uncle's coincided with my adolescence, but living without my parents, I feel like I bypassed typical teenage experiences. My mother has a personality that makes it difficult to form a common ground. Often, she seems to merely listen without truly engaging when I talk. And even now, I find myself conversing more with my father. During those times, my aunt would attentively listen to even the trivial things that happened at school. Even if my stories weren't particularly funny, she'd laugh heartily, and if I seemed down, she'd create an environment where I could comfortably share why. I often wished she was my mother during those times. When we went to the market, people often remarked how much we resembled each other. Both of us being tall and slim, it seems like people thought we were mother and daughter. My uncle often traveled for work, so I spent many days just with my aunt. She frequently mentioned how much she enjoyed my company and how it eased her loneliness. I believe she was sincere, especially considering the times she teared up, wishing she had a son like me. In high school, I often visited my uncles. Even after I started living with my parents in high school, I often visited my uncles. My aunt was always so delighted to see me that I felt obligated to visit if I hadn't been there for a while. After entering university, there were times when I couldn't visit due to hanging out with friends, dating my girlfriend, but I always tried to visit as often as I could. Upon hearing that I had a girlfriend, my aunt urged me to bring her over, and we visited a few times. After graduating from university, I broke up with the girlfriend I had intended to marry. I fell into a period of dependency on alcohol and barely managed to keep my job. But thanks to my aunt, I was able to pull myself together and return to my daily routine sooner. When talking about my uncle's house to my friends, I don't refer to it as my uncle's or my uncle's house. I say it's my aunt's place, which signifies just how important her presence has been in my life. By the betrayal of the girlfriend I had planned to marry, I thought of my aunt. My uncle, who didn't have children of his own, loved his nieces and nephews tremendously. When I was deeply hurt by the betrayal of the girlfriend I had planned to marry, I thought of my aunt. I didn't feel like going to her place, as it had been a while since my last visit, but I went anyway. It seemed like my aunt could immediately tell my emotional state just by looking at my face. When she asked what was wrong, I started to cry. I told her about how much I loved my girlfriend, how she had been meeting another man behind my back, and why it was not okay. My aunt said she couldn't understand my girlfriend. She criticized my girlfriend, saying where else could she find a handsome and smart man like me, and suggested that she'll regret her decision and come back to me one day. I fell asleep crying in her comforting embrace. It wasn't that late, but I had been drinking from the day and unknowingly fell asleep. It wasn't that late, but I had been drinking from the day and unknowingly fell asleep. After that day, I stayed at my aunt's place for a while. My parents asked me why I was there and told me to come home. It was hard for my aunt, but my aunt took my phone during the call with my parents and said she would take care of me for a while. The girlfriend I broke up with resembled my aunt. She was tall and thin, had big eyes. During my adolescence, my aunt, who had taken care of me, had unknowingly become my ideal type. When I got home from work and went to my aunt's place, she always asked if I needed a drink while preparing dinner. If I said yes, she would take out soju from the fridge. My uncle didn't drink much, so that soju was something my aunt had bought just for me. While eating and drinking, I would start to cry as the alcohol started to affect me, patting my shoulder and hugging me. Each time, my aunt would comfort me, patting my shoulder and hugging me. On the days I got really drunk, I would fall asleep without realizing, and when I woke up, I would be sleeping on the sofa. She probably couldn't move me to the room, so she just left me there and covered me with a blanket. One day, I was eating and drinking soju that my aunt had prepared. She tried to make me laugh by telling me a funny story. I forced a smile. Just as she always laughed at my trivial stories, I also laughed out loud on purpose. She said it's obvious that I was forcing myself to laugh and started to tickle me. I wriggled and laughed out loud, and she said it seemed like I was genuinely laughing now. She looked at me with a pitying look, and I thought there would be no angel like my aunt anywhere in the world. I made a vow to be a good son to my aunt, who was not treated well by her husband and mother-in-law because she couldn't have a child. I couldn't resist her tickling, so I tickled her back. We both laughed, and without realizing, I felt better. I felt the pleasant intoxication that I hadn't felt in a long time. After finishing dinner and cleaning up, my aunt decided to go to bed early. I also went to my room and tried to sleep but couldn't. So, I knocked on my aunt's door and went in. She asked why I was knocking and whether I couldn't sleep. I nodded, and she suggested that I use her arm as a pillow. As I laid down, tears welled up in my eyes. I could feel her hand trembling as she stroked my shoulder. She told me I didn't have to pretend to be okay, and I laid there looking at her. I tried to comfort her by saying her arm must be numb, so I became her pillow. As I stroked her back, I realized she wasn't wearing a bra. She looked up at me and shyly smiled, saying that she would sleep deeply in someone's arms after a long time. She told me I could do as I pleased as I aimlessly stroked her back with trembling hands. That night, we didn't sleep a wink. I realized that I hadn't been dating my girlfriend, but longing for someone like my aunt. I woke up to my aunt's soft voice telling me to get ready for work. I looked into her big eyes and realized that what happened last night wasn't a dream. I looked into her big eyes and realized that what happened last night wasn't a dream. As I said goodbye, she told me her name. From that day on, she granted all my wishes, even though it seemed like she was reluctant. After a few sleepless nights, I got a nosebleed. Even at work, I was waiting for the time to go home, not knowing how tired I was. Seeing me with a nosebleed, she told me that I had a lot of hardship for her sake, and we laughed loudly looking at each other. Her face turned red every time our eyes met. She blushed and laughed like a young girl. One day, she whispered in my ear that it was thrilling that I wanted various things. She called me a man like an amusement park ride. Seeing her reaction, like she was on a ride, was satisfying. From some point, she called me my boy or Viking. Sometimes, she said, I was like a real Viking warrior, which made me proud. I still spend more time at home, but I occasionally stay at my aunt's house for a few days. I call my aunt more than 3 times a day. She talks about what happened that day. If I can't go to her house for a while because I'm busy, she complains that it's been a long time since she rode the Viking. Then, I rush to her house right after work, and she pretends to be scared. Sometimes, she calls me her baby. Sometimes, she smiles playfully and calls me Viking. When I suggest we go outside late at night, she teases me about when I'm going to take her. I've given up on the idea of marriage. Even if I get married, it would be with a substitute for my aunt. But I wonder if there's a need to find a substitute.